Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to go over my 12 favorite settings in the Nikon Z9 and Z8. And I'll point out the differences in the menu where appropriate, but mostly they're the same. But I have found these to be the 12 best settings for me, and I hope you enjoy them as well. First, a quick note about banks. Any of the changes that are made to the photo shooting menu, the video recording menu, or the custom settings menu are only stored in those particular banks. So if you make a change to any one of these three and you note that when you're out in the field that you're not getting the settings that you set, check what bank you're in. All right, let's talk about the focus point thickness. As you can see here, it's a 1 pixel square. So it's 1 pixel wide for each part of the square. And that's for both the focus point as well as the subject detection square. Now you can change this in the custom settings menu under A11 down to focus point display. You have the options of 1, 2, or 3. This is what 2 looks like. And this is what 3 looks like. One of the things about the thickness of the border is sometimes that focus point can get lost in a very busy scene. So having slightly thicker border around your area allows you to identify where it is in the screen rather quickly. Okay, the next tip is how to quickly recenter the focus point. And that's in controls under F2. You go to the menu here and then go down to your command subselector button, which you see here on the screen, and you set that to reset. So you'll notice that here on the right hand side my focus point is not set where it should be, and just by pressing the command subset dial button straight down, as in like into the camera, it will recenter the focus point to the center of the view screen or the EV, and then I can focus on my subject. One quick caveat about the subselector is that pressing down can take a little bit of getting used to. A lot of times you'll be pressing a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, and just moving the focus point. It takes about, 30 minutes to get used to it, but just be aware sometimes you'll be moving it left or right rather than pressing straight down, especially when it's like right up on your eye. Pressing down does take a bit of practice. While we're in the F2 menu, a second button I like to set is the OK button on the back of the camera. I set that to magnify at 100% so that I can look in either the viewfinder or the back screen and zoom into the subject I'm taking a picture of and see how accurately and how clean that focus is when I press that button. You can see here that I have the camera set on my trusty companion here, and then when I press the OK button, it zooms in, allowing me to see how sharp that is at that point. One interesting helpful bit here is that you can see when I zoom in, there's a small rectangular on the bottom right with a yellow indicator that indicates a focus lock for a subject detection when you're in AFC mode. If it was AFS mode, it would be green. The next tip I'd like to go over is putting the histogram in the EVF and the back view screen. You can see here that I have a histogram that's underexposed. So I can either lower my shutter speed, possibly get a shaky image since it's a 135, or I can leave my shutter speed where it was and increase the ISO in order to get the histogram looking the way that it should. Now, of course, I could just use the metering bar on the right, but I like to get an idea of where my dynamic range is when I'm taking the pictures. You can see here that the metering bar has it slightly overexposed, and that's probably due to this rug up here on the front left. But the rug isn't my subject, the subject is my dog, and I want him to be exposed properly. So I can look at the histogram and see that it uses the whole dynamic range. So let's see how to set that up in the camera. This is one of the ones where it actually is slightly different between the Z8 and the Z9. So in the Z9, you want to go to your custom settings menu D20 and 21. That will be your EVF and your viewfinder on the back. And in the Z8, it's D17 and D18. Of course, that's with the current firmware version. These things can slightly shift based on what firmware is released. So it can change a bit, but it should be right around this area. Okay, so Nikon calls the LCD on the back of the camera the monitor, and the EVF is the viewfinder. And how they display what's available can be different, and how they're both shown on the screen and what available options there are. Most notably, on the monitor, there are 5 options that you can rotate between, and on the viewfinder, there's only 4. All right, so if you go into one of these display options, you can see that there's a list of details on the right that you can turn on and off. Simple detail or advanced detail, the virtual horizon, the histogram, which is what we're talking about, a grid that gives you the thirds, a center point, and then a center weight. The center point is just for focusing. The center weight is actually something that we'll talk about in a second. But you can turn these on and off however you see fit for both the viewfinder and the monitor on the back, and then rotate them through them when you're viewing your scene with the display button on the back of the camera. One thing to note is if you're looking at the monitor, which is the rear LCD, and you're pressing the display button, it'll rotate through the monitor options. If you're looking through the viewfinder and pressing the display button, it'll rotate through the EVF's options. All right, well, in order to turn it on, of course, you put the checkbox next to the histogram, and I actually have all of these on except for the level. One of the other things I found quite interesting to have on is this center weight. And what that does is it provides this circle around the center. And this is for your exposure. If ever you have an exposure set to center weight, it's going to look at what's in this circle. This visual representation can kind of give you an idea of what's in the area that it's going to be metering off of. The size of that center weight circle can be changed inside the B menu under B5 center weight area. You can set it up to standard, small, or average. Okay, so one of my absolute favorite settings is to turn on peaking. And what peaking does is when you're in manual focus, it will highlight what's in focus in red. Now, it's not so difficult to put it in manual mode. I know everybody's like, there's buttons here or in the settings, but you don't need to do that. When you have your camera and you're looking through it, the instant you turn your focus ring, it goes into manual mode. And it will stay in manual mode even if you have this set down over here in the back or half pressed. It'll stay in manual mode until you let go of the ring and then repress the button. Now, I'll show a really terrible example with my carpet, but you'll get the idea. And the reason why this is important is when you have a lens like this 135 plena, it is a very sharp lens and can have a very shallow depth of field. So when you are close on somebody and you focus in on their eye, it'll capture onto that eye. And then if you just move it slightly with the focus ring, it'll go on manual focus. It'll show you what's in focus. And then you can see, is the eye in focus? Is the nose in focus? Is the ear in focus? Where is the fall off? And you can look at all that by looking at the peaking that's highlighted in red. It's a very, very good tool for capturing the scene. Now, there are some times when you want some parts of the focus or some parts of the image to be out of focus, and there are parts when you want everything to be in focus. But the absolute worst is when the eye is in focus and it blurs away beautifully behind them, but then the tip of the nose is also out of focus. That just looks so bad. Let's take a quick example. Here is an image that is fine. I mean, you can post it on Facebook, it looks great, but I've tried to print it out, and unfortunately the nose is simply out of focus, and it looks terrible on a printed piece of paper. This one, on the other hand, is exactly what I was looking for. I have a nice subframing of the hands where they are out of focus, but the entire face is in focus, and it prints out great. Okay, I know this is not a pretty thing to look at, but what I want to point out is once I've manually focused and you see the peaking on the edge of this carpet, as I increase the aperture, you'll see the peaking start to spread And that gives us a feel for how much depth of field is actually in focus and how we can use that in portraiture. All right, let's see how we can turn that on. Go into the A menu, go down to A13, select focus peaking, and you can turn it on here. You can set your highlight color to be red or yellow, whatever works for you. I like red, and you can set the peaking sensitivity as well. And the best thing about this is you can leave it on, and unless you turn that manual focus ring, you'll never see it. Okay, next we're going to talk about the depth of field preview, and this is a good place for it because it kind of coincides with the tip beforehand with regard to peaking. One of the things that is very clear and is not really widely known is that the peaking method I used before, as well as the depth of field that you see in the viewfinder and or the EV, will only show you the appropriate depth of field up to 5.6, f5.6 in terms of aperture. Past that, you need to use a depth of field preview. So let's turn that on and see what difference it makes. Okay, we're going to go to the customs menu settings again, select F2, and then we're going to select a button to assign it to. In this particular case, I'm going to assign it to F1, which is the top button there on the trigger side. And I'm going to set it to this icon here, which is preview. Okay, I've got another very willing subject here, and we're going to show this as an example for both the depth of field as well as the focus peaking. If you watch closely, you can see my subject do the actual eye roll. Okay, I'm going to stop the video here and we can zoom in. You can see all the points that have the red markings from the peaking that shows what's in focus, including here at the nose, the lips, the eyes, the hair. So all of that's going to be in focus for our subject. And then we're going to go back to the ugly carpet, and I'll show you the difference when you press the preview button once we've hit the maximum aperture. All right, now watch as we go back to the ugly rug here, and you can see we are now at f16. And the depth of field on the peaking is still only those first 6 inches, and I'll put an arrow on the screen so you'll see it. But as soon as I press that preview button, you can see it jumps all the way back to here. Okay, so the gist of this particular tip is the need to change from one set of exposure settings to another rapidly. Now, in my particular example, I have a gymnastics example, and what we have here is my daughter on the tumbling floor. At this point, she's stopping, and I know that I can get away with 1/200th of a second at an ISO of about 4,000 because it's horrible lighting in there. But when she's moving in action, actually tumbling across the floor and or on this beam that you see over here, I need that 1/12,000th of a second at ISO 16,000 in order to stop the motion and get the shot that I need. But I don't have time to be flipping around with the shutter speed on the back to get this. So it's a single button press that allows me to go from one to the other. This, of course, is not the only example. Another one that many people will run across is bird in flight. You'll have a bird, a large one or a small one, sitting in a tree or in a perch, and you can take shots of it at a low shutter speed and a low ISO for the settings that you're in, but then it takes off, and now you need to move to a much faster shutter speed. With a single button push, you can jump that to a much higher shutter speed and then start to take the pictures as it moves away. All right, let's see what that looks like in practice. I have the lens cap on so we don't get distracted by things in the background, but you can see I'm at 1/1600th of a second. I'm shooting 20 frames per second raw, and I simply press a single button, and you can see the icon come on here for function recall, and the shutter speed drops to 1/200th of a second, and now I'm shooting at a lower speed of 4 frames per second. Okay, the method to set this up is to go into the F2 menu again, go down to lens function 1 and select recall shooting functions. Now you'll see right below it there's recall shooting functions hold. The difference between the two is the first one, when you have to press and hold the button for the changes to take effect. The second one, you just press it and the changes take effect, and press it again for it to undo. Again, the first one, you press and hold for the new settings to apply, and as soon as you let go, they go back to the original. Both of those two adjust the same exposure setting. So if you adjust it in one, you're adjusting it in the other. They're not different ones. Okay, you can see in here we can adjust things like the metering mode, the shutter speed, whether you're in manual or aperture priority, even the frames per second that you take when you take a picture. You don't want 20 frames per second when someone is basically standing still. Okay, we're down to the last two settings that I normally change on my cameras. This next one is back button focus, and I know it's a bit of a hot topic for a lot of people, so let me answer a quick question. Should you be using it? Probably. Is it an absolute requirement at this point in time in 2024? Maybe not. I'm not going to go into all that in this one. I have a separate video on back button focus and the pros and cons. Basically, if you plan to get into any advanced target acquisition techniques with your camera, you probably want to be very familiar with back button focus, and starting off with just using back button focus before going into the advanced techniques is probably a good place to start. So let's set that up. Okay, so what we're going to do is go into the custom settings menu, then go to F2, and then we're going to select the AF on button, as you can see it here on the screen. And then we will go back to the A menu for focus, A6 for AF activation, and then we will select AF only. Select OK. And that's it. That's how you set up back button focus. But one of the last things I wanted to say is that there are a lot of changes I made in the F2 menu for shooting, where I assign certain things to particular buttons that are good for me. I highly recommend doing that, but if you do, I would recommend setting them up one at a time, getting used to where that button is and what that button's doing before adding in a second one, or a third one, or a fourth one. Because all too often you're like, yeah, this is a great idea. I'm going to set up these buttons to do these things. And then in the moment, without a lot of practice or muscle memory, you're going to be like, what button does what? And how do I set, and then you're pushing all the different buttons trying to figure out how to get what you set up. And then ultimately end up having to go back and look into the menu to see what you set up and where it's configured to. So start with just one, use it, get comfortable with it, add in a second, and then use it, get comfortable with it, add in a third. And then as you move forward with your newer cameras, as time goes on, set them up basically the same way, and you already have muscle memory locked in on how to use those features. All right, well, thanks for watching. If you have a certain set of settings that you particularly like, I'd love to hear them down in the comment, or if you found something that you would change about the way I set mine up, please let me know. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are. Thanks.